Today is Thursday, December 2nd, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. This morning, I had a discussion with my son Samuel. My son Samuel is 15 years old, and he's my fifth child. He's the third boy born in the family and the fifth child. From his birth, it's been obvious that Samuel is slower than his older brothers and sisters, slower intellectually. He's not gifted intellectually. He has a difficult time thinking. He has a difficult time understanding what people try to communicate to him. He's not gifted intellectually like his older brothers and sisters. And we didn't realize how significantly slower he was until his younger brother was born and quickly caught up to him in development and proved to be much smarter, even though he was 18 months younger. So we've known for a long time that Samuel is, intellectually speaking, slow. And he's surrounded by more gifted brothers and sisters. And again, when I talk about slow and gifted, I'm talking about intellectual matters. Intellectually slow. Now, Samuel, while he's slower intellectually, he's a very great worker. With farm tasks and mechanical tasks, I've allowed Samuel to do things on the farm that I haven't allowed his older brothers and sisters to do. Because when it comes to work, Samuel can work. And if it wasn't for compulsory school laws that require kids to be in school rather than working, Samuel would be enjoying some good years of work. In fact, neighbors of ours hire Samuel to work because they love having him work for them. Out in the country, a boy like Samuel is very useful. And Samuel can make hundreds of dollars by manual labor that he's willing to do that his brothers and sisters aren't. So he's slow intellectually and struggles academically, but he's better mechanically, and he's able to work, not just to do physical tasks, but to do physical tasks for extended periods of time, which is how real work is done. Samuel can handle equipment, he can manage a tractor, he can plow a field, he can till gardens, he can handle equipment and machinery. He's a mechanical kid. He's a good worker. But intellectually, he's very slow. And so this morning, now that Samuel is 15 years old and he's starting to think about future plans, He wants to join the military like his older brothers and sister have done. And in order to do that, he's going to have to take a test. The ASVAB test, the Asvab Test. He's going to have to take that test. And so he's concerned about the test because the test determines what opportunities soldiers have in terms of career choices in the military. A low score on the Asvab limits the careers that a soldier can choose from. A high score on the Asvab gives the soldier the opportunity to choose any career he wishes. Samuel wants to join the military, but he's concerned about his Asvab scores. He's concerned about the Asvab test. So we got him a test prep book, just like we have the other kids. And today he came in to talk a little bit because he's concerned about it and wants to do well. And so I talked to him about the 4 different kinds of students. And as I saw him encouraged by the talk, I thought maybe it's a talk that I should share so that it can encourage other students as well, because I am certain that other families face the same situations where they have a mixture of kids with different interests and abilities, and managing the different kids, the different personalities, the different vocations can be challenging at times. And our society picks and chooses which gifts it will honor and which it will despise. And it's not God's will that these things be judged in the way that our society judges them. So what I told Samuel, and I always speak to my kids very frankly about their abilities, their strengths and weaknesses, their gifts, their assets and liabilities, as it were, because they have to have a right understanding, an honest understanding of themselves, so that they can act responsibly and make the best of their life circumstances. These discussions can be difficult at times and humbling, and many parents, I think, choose to try and puff kids up and fill them with a false sense of confidence. You know, it's called self-confidence, which is just foolishness. There's a healthy and necessary honesty, a necessary self-evaluation, self-understanding that students have to gain so that they can have reasonable and realistic thoughts about their opportunities and potential, so they can make good decisions. If you read the Baltimore Catechism, where it teaches about vocations, it says that there are 2 elements to a vocation. It has to do with aptitude and interest. These 2 elements, aptitude or ability to do something, and interest. And we have to accept the reality that kids cannot do whatever they want to. Kids are limited in what they can do by gifts that God distributes, by opportunities that God makes available. And they have to respect providence in their lives, or they'll just frustrate themselves in vain. And so we need to talk about these things honestly and soberly. not stupidly, as many do today who try to ignore the problems or just try and brush them away by false positive talk that's contradicted by reality. Now, our children and all of us know the truth. And that's why that fake talk in the long run isn't respected. And when someone tells us the truth, it may hurt, it may be uncomfortable, but we know that that person is honest. And we know that that person is right. And we learn to trust that person, even though we may kick against the goads, as it were, and argue or push back. We know that that person is right, and we learn to respect the honesty of that person. And so in talking with my son today, I explained to him that there are 4 different kinds of students. And the 4 different kinds of students are divided by 2 different characteristics. The first characteristic that divides students is that some students are intellectually gifted and other students are not intellectually gifted. And we can consider extremes being like extraordinary prodigies or young geniuses on one side, at the top of the scale, let's say, and then the mentally retarded and extreme cases of severe mental disability at the bottom of the spectrum. The first division is between the gifted and the not gifted, intellectually speaking. That characteristic between being gifted or not gifted is entirely providential. There is no morality in it. There's no personal responsibility in it. It's like being born without arms or legs or being born blind. There's nothing that a person can do to change that situation. And it's not a person's responsibility to change that situation. It's a fact of God's providence. And that's the first characteristic that divides students. Gifted and not gifted. And of course, there's a spectrum. The second characteristic is different. It has to do with being diligent or lazy. The second characteristic that divides students is diligence or laziness. Diligence being the positive virtue, laziness being the negative vice. This difference, or this characteristic, is different from the first because it is not providential. It's moral. A student chooses to be diligent or to be lazy. The first characteristic is a matter of God's will. The second characteristic is a matter of our will. We choose to be diligent or to be lazy. And so these 2 characteristics, giftedness and diligence, And the combinations of them produce 4 different kinds of students. The best of all students, the best, is the student who is gifted and diligent. That's the best student. Gifted and diligent. And on the opposite side, the worst student is the student who is not gifted and not diligent. That's the worst student. And in between these 2 opposite extremes, we have gifted students who are lazy, and we have students who are not gifted but are diligent. Four different kinds of students. Gifted and diligent being the best. Not gifted and not diligent being the worst. And then 2 medium conditions. Not gifted but diligent, and gifted but not diligent. Now, when we talk to a child, we're talking to one of 2 kinds of students. We're either talking to a gifted student or we're talking to a not gifted student. And our message to the student, first of all, has to be to help them understand what it means to be gifted or not gifted. To be gifted means that certain skills or abilities come quite naturally, without much effort. I give my son the example of a young man who, when he's 15 years old, is 6.5 feet tall, who wants to play basketball. Being 6.5 feet tall gives him an advantage in basketball that he personally has nothing to do with. It's natural giftedness. And if another boy is under 5 feet tall at the same age, he is not gifted with respect to height. And we have to understand that God causes there to be a difference between people. Some are gifted in certain ways, and others are not. We need to talk to students, and we need to help them to understand whether they are gifted or not gifted and why that's so. There are signs for gifted students. One of the signs of a gifted intellectual is a sense of humor, the ability to see and comment and criticize and make fun. Humor is a sign of intellect. It's an awareness that something foolish has happened. It's an awareness that something comical is going on. The ability to understand figures of speech, to understand twists and turns of language, and so on. Humor is a good measure of intellect. A gifted student can do well when he wants to in school. It's like a switch he can flip. And when he needs to, he can do well easily. He has the ability, he's gifted, and that giftedness comes from God. And a student who is gifted has to understand that he's gifted. I can give you examples from my own life because I was such a child. When I was 5 years old, I was sent to a public school, and in kindergarten, my teacher used to give me the book to read to the class. My teacher, even when I was 5 years old, knew that I was gifted, told me that I was gifted, and gave me responsibilities because I was gifted. I could easily read at age 5 and was given the opportunity to read to the class during reading time or during story times. In first grade, when it was time to choose parts for the school play, my teacher immediately singled me out and said, "You're going to be the jester." And I was set aside as the jester in the play because the jester had clever, funny lines to say. And the teacher said, "This part, you're perfect for this part." That was in first grade. Later on in high school, my teachers used to complain because I was in all honors classes and I never studied. I graduated high school at age 18 and I never once read a book. Never. Even though I graduated in honors English classes. Never read a book. My giftedness allowed me to cheat and just turn on academics whenever I needed to. If my grades started to slip and I was going to get in trouble with my sports coach and I couldn't fool around anymore, time was running out on the marking period and I needed to get my grades up, I could just hit the switch, blow out a few A's, and do well enough. And it used to drive my teachers crazy because they saw the potential that I had and I just wasted it. I had a Spanish teacher who I studied honors Spanish with through high school. And when it was time to apply to college, she refused to write a reference letter for me. And she told me the reason she wouldn't write a reference letter for me was because I didn't make use of my abilities, and she didn't trust that I was going to make use of them in college. And therefore, she didn't want to write a reference letter for me. I was awarded with the Class Clown award in high school as a senior, which I felt was kind of embarrassing because I never got in trouble, and yet my peers all saw me as a clown because they knew that I didn't even try and was in all honors classes. And when SAT scores came out, I had one of the highest scores in the school, which just made my place as the class clown even more clear. I was always gifted, but I was not diligent. And there were signs, even from my earliest days in school, of that intellectual giftedness, which when I converted and became a Christian, all of a sudden, my intellectual gifts were joined with a fear of God and a desire to gain wisdom. And when grace came into my life, then those intellectual gifts finally started to work, or I started to put them to work. But we need to help students understand, if they are gifted, that they are gifted. And at the same time, if we see that children are not intellectually gifted, we also need to communicate that and help them to understand that they lack certain gifts that other students have. It's important for us to understand our weaknesses, because we can adapt and overcome many of them, but we have to know what they are. We learn this in sports. In sports, there were certain things that I was not good at. I was a slow runner in sports. Even though I was very athletic and played sports my whole life, I was a slow runner. And so I had to take that into account as I played. It affected the strategy of the games. I couldn't rely on speed, as some players could. I had to adapt and find other advantages, one of which was my intellect. I had to outthink other players. I had to be smart and use my intelligence to overcome my lack of speed. Which position I played was determined by my strengths and weaknesses. It's good for us to know not just what our strengths are, but also what our weaknesses are. And if we have a weakness intellectually, we need to be helped to understand that. We need to be helped to understand that other kids grasp things in school more easily and quickly than we can. And there are ways to overcome that. So it's important for us to communicate with our children. And we're talking about intellect here, whether they are gifted intellectually or not gifted intellectually. Now, the reason why it's always important to talk about gifts is because when a gift is not received or possessed rightly, it leads to all kinds of problems. In most situations, and this was true of myself, when someone has a gift, but they don't have good counsel and direction, the gift becomes a source of pride and arrogance, and they look down on others as if they're superior because they're simply gifted, even though they've done nothing to merit or deserve this gift. And what happens is people who have gifts tend to mock and criticize those who don't have gifts. And they tend to rely on those gifts to cruise through life. They flip it into cruise control and just ride on their gifts. When we don't have the right goals in life, when we're not teaching children to seek to fulfill God's purpose for their lives, this abuse of gifts is made possible. And society, the adult society around these children, stupidly fans this fire We talk about how kids are so smart. We tell the kids how smart they are. We set low standards. We judge everything in groups. We grade kids relative to other kids, and none of this is proper. None of this is right. To have a group of children that we artificially assemble according to their age and then distribute grades so that the quote-unquote smart kids can be honored and the ungifted kids can be penalized is the error of the adults in a society. God did not send groups of children into the world. God deals with individuals, and morality is an individual matter. There's an important principle that needs to be taught to every child. At the end of this life, each of us is going to stand before God alone, as an individual. And each of us is going to be judged not according to some absolute standard that's applied to everyone equally. We're going to be judged relatively. Jesus taught us this when he said, "To whom much is given, much is expected." To whom much is given, much is expected. And this is a concept that we need to drill into our children's minds, especially if they are gifted. Again, in this talk, I'm primarily concerned with intellectual giftedness, but this applies to any kind of giftedness. To whom much is given, much is expected. And the question that we need to think about, and we need to teach our children to think about, is how are you going to give an account to God when He asks you what you did with the gifts that you were given? And this is why the school model is so dangerous morally, because it allows gifted children to be puffed up, to think that as long as they're one step ahead of their peers, they're quote-unquote smart kids. Whereas what every single person should be asking is, am I serving God in the best way possible? Am I glorifying God in my life? Am I making use of the gifts that God has given me to bring about the greatest possible return for my Lord? These are ideas taught in Christ's parables. The parable of the talents, which has nothing to do with natural talent. A talent was a unit of measure for money in the ancient world. The parable of talents is about a lord giving to different servants different amounts of money and telling them to go and do business. And they come back to give an account to their lord of what they've done with the money that they were given to invest and do business with. And the principle is, if one servant is given more money to trade with than another, more profit is expected from that servant to whom more money was given. And if a servant was given a little bit of money, he's not going to be expected to bring back the same profit absolutely speaking, as the servant who is given more money. This is the message of the parable of the talents, and it's not just talking about money, it's a parable. It's teaching a universal principle that to whom much is given in any way, much is expected. Every child needs to have this concept drilled into his mind, to know that he is not going to be judged for whether he's better than the person next to him, or whether he's a step ahead of his peers, or whether he does enough to check the boxes. And this is what's especially evil about minimum requirements in education, which many Christians even are content with. That's not the question we should ever be asking. We should be asking, am I trading with the gifts that I've been given so as to bring to my Lord the greatest possible return? That's what we should desire to do. That's what it means to live for the glory of God. Am I doing the best that I individually can with the gifts that God has given to me individually? It doesn't matter what anyone else does. It doesn't matter if I'm a step ahead of my peers. It doesn't matter if I've done more than the next person. What matters is whether what I have done is proportional to the giftedness that I possess. That's what matters. To whom much is given, much is expected. And that's the key to humility. That's what keeps a person humble and working hard, regardless of what success he or she may have. A good example of this can be found in St. Paul the Apostle. St. Paul was, or is considered, the greatest missionary in the history of the church. When people spoke of him, they said that he turned the world upside down. His ministry was so influential, so incredible. He performed miracles. He converted entire cities of people, started churches all throughout the Roman Empire. And yet when it was time, at the end of the day, for St. Paul to evaluate his own life and work, he was afraid that he wasn't doing enough because he was conscious that he had been given so much. He knew that he would be judged not compared to what other men do, but he would be judged compared to what could be done with the gifts that he was given. Gifts like visions, miracles, extraordinary education as a young man, and so on. He was a Jew who possessed Roman citizenship. Every benefit was given to him to equip him for the ministry for which he was separated by God. And St. Paul lived with constant concern that even though he was personally responsible for the evangelization of much of the Roman Empire, he might still not be doing enough proportionally to the gifts that he had been given. He said, "Woe unto me if I do not preach the gospel." He said, "I buffet my body, I beat my body and make it my slave, lest, having preached to others, I myself might be disqualified. He was so concerned about the effectiveness of his ministry that he refused to accept financial support and insisted on working with his own hands to provide for his own expenses simply because he could. We see in St. Paul an excellent example of a man who is extraordinarily gifted and yet understands that great responsibility comes with those gifts, that to whom much is given, much is going to be expected. St. James, I believe it was, who warned, "Let not many of you desire to become teachers, for teachers shall receive stricter judgment." That is, those who are truly gifted with the intellect necessary to be an effective teacher, because they are given these unique gifts and opportunities and platforms from which to influence others, in the back of their minds needs to be this constant awareness that as their influence increases, as their gifts increase, so their judgment will be stricter and stricter. And this is the source of the humility that we find in saintly people who are extraordinarily gifted and yet lowly of mind, humble of heart, poor in spirit. Their gifts don't lead them to be puffed up and exalted. They don't think that they have an advantage over others, but they see that these gifts being given to them are all coming with a cost. A good example of this can be seen in Henry V by William Shakespeare. Whether you read the play or watch Kenneth Branagh's production of it on film, there's a scene where, before a great battle with the French, I'm not sure if it was actually before the Battle of Agincourt or one of the battles leading up to Agincourt, but there's a scene where King Henry is up late at night preparing for battle as the king. And he's looking upon some peasants in his army who are sound asleep, who don't have a care in the world because they don't bear any of the responsibilities of the king. And yet here is the king pacing in the middle of the night, racked with thoughts and concerns and cares of the coming battle. And King Henry gives this beautiful speech about the disadvantages that the king has. That all that he has, all that being the king gives him, is pomp and ceremony. And yet the slave, or the peasant, he says, sleeps in Elysium, in peace. And this is what gifted men who are wise understand. And this needs to be taught to our children, that to whom much is given, much is expected. This is the antidote to that arrogance that develops in the minds of kids who are gifted. And I'm always cutting my kids down, telling them, it doesn't matter what you've done, what matters what you could have done, and what you have done in relation to what you could have done. That's what you should be concerned with. That's all that matters for you as an individual, not what you have done, but what you have done relative to what you could have done. And that's the question that I ask myself every day. Not what have I done, but what have I done relative to what I could have done with the gifts that God has given to me. So we need to teach our children to help them understand, if they are gifted, that they are gifted, and to teach them the accountability that comes with that. Because giftedness doesn't bring us to success. Giftedness really has nothing to do with our own will. It's a matter of God's providence, and it could be actually a cause of our fall and destruction rather than our good. It's a dangerous thing. And we have to teach our children how to think of their lives rightly. We need to teach our children that though they're gifted, the test in their life is whether they will diligently exercise those gifts or whether they will lazily neglect those gifts. And therefore they're in danger if they choose to lazily neglect the gifts that have been given to them, because they're going to have to give an account for them, what they've done with them, how they've used them. Some kids use their gifts in order to sin. And they have to be taught how dangerous this is. They have to be taught that they are gifted, if they are gifted, and they have to be taught that now the question is, what will they do with those gifts? Will they employ them and exercise them diligently and fulfill their potential, which makes it possible for them to be the best of students? Or will they waste those gifts, be lazy, and lose all of their advantages because of their immoral decisions? And on the flip side, children who are not gifted have to be helped so that they don't despair or fall into some kind of self-pitying depression which is unreasonable, because giftedness is not a matter of fate or destiny. In most cases, it's an opportunity to merit greater rewards. Why do we talk about David killing Goliath? Why is that story significant? It's significant because Goliath was a gifted warrior, a giant, powerful, experienced warrior, and David was a young boy with no experience in war who couldn't even carry a soldier's armor. Yet David's faith and courage allowed him to overcome Goliath by strategy and gained for David eternal praise. And we celebrate David because he overcame his disadvantages to defeat his enemy and glorify God by diligence, by courage, by virtue, by faith, by intelligence. We celebrate David's victory over Goliath because it was meritorious, because he overcame disadvantages. And if we have a child who is not gifted, we need to teach them this concept of overcoming disadvantages to merit greater rewards. And this is the discussion that I had today with my son Samuel. I drew a diagram on a piece of paper for my son, and I said there are 4 different kinds of students. There are those who are gifted, and there are those who are not gifted. And I said, Samuel, intellectually speaking, you are not gifted. And he knows that, and we address it frankly. I say, you are not gifted intellectually, and here's how this works out. If a student is gifted and diligent, he will be the best student. And there's nothing that you can do, Samuel, that will allow you to compete with a gifted student who is diligent. He will always be the best. And it's his duty to be the best, to fulfill his potential. And whether he does that is between him and God. And if he's better than you, it doesn't matter, because he's more gifted and he should be better. And so it's nothing to brag about. He can take no credit for his giftedness, though he can take credit for his diligence. But most boys who will be gifted and diligent will also be humble, because diligence is exhausting. And those who work are usually humble. And I told Samuel, the danger in your life is that you will be lazy. Because if you are lazy, you will be the worst kind of student. To not be gifted and to be lazy will make you the worst and can destroy your life. If you are lazy, you can destroy your life because you are not gifted. And I explained that another type of student is a gifted student who is lazy. And that gifted student who is lazy is going to have to give an account to God for his laziness, for wasting the gifts that he was given. But that student can often coast on his giftedness and get done what needs to get done. And so I told Samuel, if you are lazy, a gifted student who is also lazy will beat you, will do better than you, even though both of you are lazy, because he is gifted. And he can get stuff done quickly and relatively easily when he needs to. But you won't be able to do that. Because when you come down to that last hour, you won't be able to quickly recover and get the work done like he will. And this is the danger of having kids who fool around in school, because many of them are smart, gifted kids who will fool around until the last hour, and then will quickly flip the switch, get the grades they need, and be okay. But what they do is they have a negative moral influence on the non-gifted kids, who float along with them and then get left behind at the last hour when those gifted kids quickly get the work done that needs to be done. And this is one of the reasons why allowing gifted kids to fool around in school is unfair to the kids who are not gifted. And I explained to Samuel that if he's lazy, and another kid is also lazy, but that kid is gifted intellectually, that kid will be able to do okay because he's gifted. Whereas Samuel might be left with no more time to recover. And by being lazy, without intellectual gifts, can destroy your life. But, and this is the point of this whole discussion, but if you choose to be diligent, if you seek advice and work as hard as you can achieve more and do better than a gifted student who is lazy. And that has to be your goal. Your goal is not to compete with the gifted, diligent student or to compare yourself. Because this is what most students do. They'll compare themselves to the extreme. They'll compare themselves to the most gifted student who's also diligent. There's no comparing to that student. He's the best. The danger for the student who's not gifted is to be lazy. Because if that lack of giftedness is joined with sloth or laziness, that's how one's life gets destroyed. One gets himself into such a deep hole early on in life that he's never able to recover. That's the danger that parents have to keep children out of who are not gifted. They can't let them fall too far behind or fall into too deep a hole, because a gifted student will be able to recover. I fell behind in high school, but when I was 18, 19, 20 years old, I was able to get my act together and recover. A student who's not gifted will not be able to do that. And parents have to be very careful that they don't let children who do not have intellectual gifts fall behind because they can't recover. But as Samuel stood looking at this Asvab test ahead of him, I told him, I said, your older brothers and sisters were gifted. They're very bright. They're very intelligent. And they went through different spurts and different cycles where at times they were diligent, at other times they were lazy. And even though some of them were lazy a good amount of the time, and Samuel saw that and experienced that, they were still able to score very highly on their military examinations and gain all the benefits. They were able to recover even though they had squandered time and opportunities because they were gifted. And I warned him that he will not be able to do that. But if he works hard, he could possibly achieve even better scores than they did, because the question is, how will giftedness and diligence combine? That's the question. The giftedness is none of your business. You have nothing to do with that. There's nothing you can do about that except pray. You can pray that God will give you greater gifts And He will, if He judges that to be good for your life within His will. But your primary responsibility has to do with your own will. And you have to choose to be diligent. You have to manage your time diligently. You can't afford to waste time. You have to manage your energy every day. This is something that I always stress with people because people don't take it seriously enough. The amount of energy, mental energy, physical energy that you have every day is limited. And I watch daily as people just waste so much energy, mental energy, physical energy on nonsense. And then they use weariness as an excuse to not do things, but they had sufficient energy to do those things. They simply wasted it. And I believe that conserving energy throughout the day and making sure that your energy is used for necessary works and not wasted on unnecessary activities is a very important responsibility that many people neglect. And then they use weariness as an excuse. But it's not a just excuse. Diligence has to do with making the most of your time, making the most of your energy, making the most of your resources, whether it's money or friends or connections or relatives that can help you, making the most of those resources. If you have access to the internet, how you use that resource, you have access to videos and movies and all kinds of multimedia resources, how you use those resources. All of that has to do with diligence. And a diligent man, or I should say boy in this case, will easily overcome his disadvantages and outperform a gifted student who is lazy. And most of the work that needs to be done in life has much more to do with diligence than with giftedness. Much of the work of life has much more to do with who's willing to take responsibility for a job and just do the work than any kind of extraordinary, prodigious giftedness. And so I told Samuel, you have 2 years, being that he's 15, you have 2 years to prepare to score well on this test, and a good score on that test can change your whole life. It really is amazing. A good score on the Asvab gives a boy the opportunity to choose any career he wishes in the military, receive the highest quality training in that field, to serve his time in the military, have the option of choosing a military career if he wants to, have the option to go to college for free if he wants to. And then when military obligations are fulfilled, having the opportunity to take all of those qualifications, all of that training, all of that experience, and then be able to use it in your own private civilian life is just an incredible advantage. And all of that can be affected by a high score on one test when a boy is 17 or 18 years old. So these tests are high stakes tests, and they need to be prepared for because they're high stakes tests. But it doesn't matter whether you're gifted or not. What matters most is that you're diligent, that you exhaust every resource at your disposal, because at the end of the day, if you've exhausted every resource you have, you're going to be able to go to bed with a good conscience. In sports, we used to say, leave it all on the field. If you're not exhausted and passing out at the end of the game and you lose, you're going to have this thought gnawing at you that you might have won had you pushed a little more or challenged a little harder. But if you leave it all on the field, at the end of the game, all you can do is line up and shake hands and recognize that better man won, better team won. And that allows us to live with peace, even when things don't go well, knowing that we did all that we could. And that's very important, especially in modern circles where there's all of this attempt to talk about mental health. You will never have mental health if you're not making the most of your gifts and opportunities. If you're not exercising every power in your control, if you're not exhausting every resource, you're going to live with regret and confusion and depression and end up in a state of despair. Not because God doesn't love you, not because the world is evil, but because you'll be plunged into troubles in life and have this worm gnawing at your soul, reminding you of the time and resources and opportunities wasted, and that these situations are your fault. A person who does all that he or she can and goes into difficult times goes in with a completely different mindset than a person who has been neglectful and lazy. And that's why these sins of sloth and despair relate to one another. All of the different sources of sin relate to one another. It's why we need to live a holy life. And it's why, as people move further and further away from God's commandments and do not live in the fear of God and do not live virtuous lives, we're just going to hear more and more about all of this mental health trouble, because people's souls are destroyed by sin. And so at the end of this talk, my son Samuel had a big smile on his face, had some wind in his sails, and he was ready to go get to work. And as I walked out of the house just an hour ago to take this walk, he was at the table in the living room with his test prep book, working hard. It doesn't matter if you don't have the gifts that others do. If by your virtue, by your own will, you overcome that disadvantage. And to tell you the truth, it's very satisfying to beat someone who's more gifted than you and know that you earned that achievement by your own virtue, by your own will, something that you can take credit for, and you overcame your disadvantages. That's a very satisfying victory, satisfying, confidence-building, courage-building achievement that just continues to build in a person greater courage for the future. And we have to help our kids get these victories in life started when they're young and get this ball rolling. Not by fake, puffed up self-confidence talk, which is just a delusion, but real achievement-based, based accomplishments that build courage. After all, when David stood before Goliath and volunteered to fight him, King Saul objected because David was young and had no experience in battle. And what David said to the king was, "Look, when I took care of my father's sheep, there were times when I had to fight against bears and lions, and I was able to overcome them. And with my courage growing from those experiences, from those past victories, I now have the confidence, achievement-based confidence, to take on this Philistine who blasphemes the name of the Lord." David's confidence was rooted in his faith. That's certainly true, but it was also fueled by past experiences. And we need to help our children gain those experiences and learn to overcome their disadvantages and win, so that when they face the next challenge in life, a bigger and more intimidating challenge, they'll have that past experience to remember and say, "You know, I remember when I stood in front of the Asvab Test, how intimidating it was, how I felt my weaknesses and disadvantages, how I struggled with uncertainty. But if I was able to overcome that obstacle, why can't I overcome this obstacle as well?" That's the real source of courage that our kids need, and we need to help them build that while they're young. So there are 4 types of students. Some gifted, some not gifted. And that's a matter of God's will, not in our control. We're not responsible for that. The other difference is between diligence and laziness. That is within our control, and we are responsible for that. We need to help our children not try to label themselves or allow themselves to be labeled and then act as if a disadvantage is a disability, or as if a disadvantage is an excuse to quit. But to see that it's normal for the disadvantaged, by their diligence, to outperform those with advantages. And they have the opportunity to do that. They're going to be tested to see whether they are that kind of person. And in the end, they're either going to have the satisfaction of having overcome their disadvantages by their own diligence and merit for themselves great rewards, or they're going to have to live in that dark regret, looking back at lost opportunities and wasted experiences, telling themselves that they're justified and excused because of disadvantages, when they know in their souls that their lack of gifts is not the real reason for their troubles. These are the 4 different kinds of students. And our children have to be taught these things, and they have to choose which one of the 4 kinds of students they're going to be. Each has a choice between 2 types of students. Gifted children have a choice between being the diligent, gifted students who are the best, and the lazy, gifted students. And students who lack gifts have to choose between being the diligent students that overcome their disadvantages and achieve great things anyway, or those who are lazy and become the worst of all students. Many parents struggle with this dilemma themselves. Many parents are struggling in lives where they face troubles and all kinds of problems in their life because they chose to be lazy. And if that's true, there's only one thing that you can do about it, and it's change it. And in changing it, teach your children to avoid the mistakes that you made. Notice I didn't say, teach the children to avoid the mistakes you made. That's hypocrisy. I said, change it and teach your children to avoid the mistakes you made. Thanks be to God. His grace affected me when I was just 18, 19 years old, and I was able to recover. And I believe that I can say that since I was 19 years old, about 27 years now, I've worked diligently to try and make the most of my gifts. And my dream, my prayer for myself is that God will give me the opportunity to live a long life and just continue to work and work and work. Because when I look back and see what I've been able to do over those past 27 years, and I think that God could possibly give me another 27 years, the opportunity to keep working gets me very excited. And I want students to live with that same kind of excitement about opportunities and challenges and work. Life is so exciting, and every sacrifice we make, every work we undertake, God promises to reward us in eternity. There's so much motivation for us to undertake great projects, great problems, great challenges, and when we do so with disadvantages, it makes it even more glorious. And that virtuous life, with a hope of eternal life, to be able to stand before Christ on Judgment Day, and bring our good works with us, so that when we're examined by Christ and He says, you were given this and this and this, what have you to show for it? We can show an impressive array of works that we've achieved, even though, as Christ tells us, as we acknowledge the grace that's responsible for those works, that we've brought no actual profit to our Master, because we've only done what is our duty. I hope that's helpful. God bless your studies.